The interview chamber hummed with the low vibration of the space station's life support systems. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Council sat across from the trembling figure hunched in the reinforced chair. The being before him was barely recognizable as one of the galaxy's most decorated military strategists. General Vexthal, hero of 12 campaigns and conqueror of the Helix Nebula, now shook uncontrollably whenever the topic turned to humans. "General, the Council needs to understand," Kethvar said gently, his forearms folded in a gesture of patience. "Your reports speak of impossible feats, of tactics that defy all known military doctrine. The other species are beginning to panic. Some refuse to believe your accounts entirely." Vexthal's compound eyes darted around the room before settling on the ambassador. His carapace, once a brilliant emerald green that had inspired confidence in troops across a dozen star systems, had dulled to a sickly gray-brown. The general's mandibles clicked nervously as he struggled to form words. "You want me to tell you about the humans again?" Vexthal whispered, his voice barely audible above the station's ambient noise. "About what I witnessed during the Terran Contact War?" Kethvar nodded slowly. "The Council's xenobiologists insist there must be some explanation. Humans are a relatively young species, barely out of their home system when first contact occurred. Their technology, while innovative, shouldn't have posed a significant threat to our combined fleets." A bitter laugh escaped Vexthal's throat, a sound like grinding metal. "Shouldn't have? Ambassador, you speak like someone who's never seen a human in actual combat. You think in terms of logic, of predictable biological responses to stress and fear. Humans don't follow those rules." The general's hands trembled as he reached for the glass of synthesized nutrient fluid on the table between them. The liquid sloshed as he brought it to his mandibles, and Kethvar noticed the way Vexthal's grip tightened whenever he spoke of the humans. "Tell me about the first encounter," Kethvar prompted. "Start from the beginning." Vexthal closed his eyes, and, for a moment, the ambassador thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, the general began to speak. It was supposed to be a routine expansion mission. The humans had established a small research outpost in the Kepler 442 system, well within what we considered our territorial expansion zone. Our intelligence suggested they had perhaps 50 individuals, mostly scientists and support staff. Standard protocol called for a demonstration of superior force, followed by negotiations for peaceful relocation. The general's voice grew steadier as he fell into the rhythm of military reporting, but his hands never stopped shaking. "I commanded a battle group of 47 vessels, destroyers, cruisers, and my flagship, the Eternal Victory. Our total complement was nearly 15,000 trained warriors from 6 different species. The humans had 3 small vessels, converted cargo haulers, according to our scans. Maybe 200 souls total." Kethvar made a note on his datapad. The humans were outnumbered 75 to 1. "Numbers," Vexthal spat, his composure cracking. "You still think in numbers. That was our first mistake. We assumed that numerical superiority meant anything to them." The general stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the metal floor. He began to pace, his movements jerky and unpredictable. "We broadcast the standard ultimatum. Surrender your claim to the system, relocate your people, and no harm would come to them. Do you know what their response was, Ambassador?" Kethvar shook his head. "Laughter. They laughed at us. 47 warships demanding their surrender, and they laughed." Vexthal stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair. Then, their leader, a female called Captain Sarah Chun, opened a direct communication channel to my flagship. The general's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She looked directly into the camera, and I swear I could see death itself reflected in her eyes. "Unknown vessels," she said, "you are trespassing on human territory. You have 30 seconds to reverse course before we consider you a hostile threat." Kethvar's own hands had gone still. What did you do? What any rational military commander would do. I ignored the obvious bluff and proceeded with the mission. I ordered a warning shot across the bow of their lead vessel. Vexthal's mandibles clicked rapidly. The plasma bolt missed their ship by less than a kilometer. It should have been enough to demonstrate our technological superiority and convince them to negotiate. But it wasn't. Ambassador, they didn't even attempt to communicate further. No pleas for mercy, no attempts at negotiation. The moment that warning shot fired, their three ships simply changed. The general moved to the chamber's single viewport, staring out at the swirling nebula beyond. I've been a warrior for over 2 centuries. I've seen every known form of space combat, from the elegant formations of the Selenite fleet to the chaotic swarm tactics of the Hive worlds. But what those humans did, it was like watching death itself take physical form. Kethvar felt a chill run through his nervous system. He had served in diplomatic corps for decades, had negotiated with species ranging from the peaceful crystalline entities to the warlike magma lords. Never had he seen a decorated general reduced to this state by mere memories. They didn't retreat or attempt to flee, Vexthal continued. Those 3 converted cargo haulers charged directly at my battle group. Not toward our flanks or attempting to break through our lines. They came straight at us, like they were planning to ram the eternal victory itself. The general pressed his face against the viewport, his breath fogging the reinforced transparent aluminum. I ordered all weapons to target the approaching vessels. 47 ships opened fire simultaneously. The space between us lit up like a newborn star. Plasma bolts, particle beams, photon torpedoes, enough firepower to sterilize a small moon. Kethvar found himself leaning forward despite himself. What happened? They flew through it. Vexthal's voice was flat, emotionless. Somehow, those 3 ships navigated through a wall of death that should have vaporized them instantly. They rolled, twisted, dove, climbed, movements that should have been impossible for vessels of that size and design. It was like watching leaves dance in a hurricane while somehow never being touched by the wind. The ambassador made another note, though his hand was no longer entirely steady. Perhaps their ships had some form of advanced defensive technology we hadn't detected? Vexthal turned from the viewport, and Kethvar was startled by the haunted look in the general's compound eyes. That's what I told myself initially. Unknown shield technology, advanced countermeasures, perhaps some form of localized space-time distortion. But then, I started watching the tactical displays more carefully. The general returned to his chair, sitting heavily. Our targeting systems were functioning perfectly. Our weapons were firing where they should have been. But, somehow, the humans always knew where each shot would be before we fired. They would begin evasive maneuvers before our gunners had even acquired target lock. Impossible, Kethvar breathed. I thought so too. But, then, Captain Chin's voice came over the communication channel again. She wasn't even breathing heavily, Ambassador. Here she was, piloting a ship through the heaviest concentration of firepower in known galactic history. And she sounded like she was reading a technical manual. Vexthal's mandibles clicked in agitation. Is that all you've got? She asked. Just like that. Casual, almost bored. We were hoping for more of a challenge. The general stood again, unable to remain still. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a normal species. No rational being should have been capable of what they were doing. The stress alone should have killed them. The gravitational forces from those maneuvers should have turned their bodies to liquid. Kethvar felt his own breathing becoming rapid and shallow. What happened next? The 3 human ships reached our formation. I expected them to continue their charge, perhaps attempt ramming attacks. Instead, they did something that still haunts my sleep cycles. Vexthal's voice dropped to a whisper. They stopped. Stopped. Dead stop, relative to our flagship. Just sitting there in space, surrounded by 47 warships, all weapons trained on them. Captain Chin opened communications again. The general's entire body was shaking now. You missed, she said. All of you. Thousands of shots fired, and not a single hit. We're disappointed. Then, she paused, and I could hear her speaking to her crew. Okay, people, I think we've played long enough. Time to show them what humans can do when we're not holding back. Kethvar felt a deep chill in his core. General, what did she mean by not holding back? Vexthal looked directly at the ambassador, and, for the first time since the interview began, his voice was completely steady. Ambassador, everything I've told you so far? That was the humans being gentle with us. That was them playing. The chamber fell silent except for the steady hum of the life support systems. Outside the viewport, the nebula continued its ancient dance, beautiful and serene. But, inside the interview room, 2 beings sat in the growing understanding that they were discussing something that had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Kethvar realized his own hands were beginning to tremble. Ambassador Kethvar stared at General Vexthal for several moments, processing the implications of what he had just heard. The silence stretched between them until finally, the ambassador found his voice. "General, when you say they were playing with your battle group, I mean exactly that," Vexthal interrupted, his voice gaining strength as he delved deeper into the memory. What happened next proved that every evasive maneuver, every impossible dodge, every moment where they seemed to barely escape destruction, it was all completely deliberate. They were toying with us. The general moved back to the viewport, his reflection ghost-like against the cosmic backdrop. Captain Chen's ship moved first. Not the aggressive charge I expected, but something far worse: precision. In the span of 17 seconds, that single converted cargo hauler disabled 6 of my destroyers. Kethvar felt his throat constrict. Disabled how? Surgical strikes, Vexthal said, his voice taking on the clinical tone of a battlefield report. They targeted specific systems with a level of accuracy that shouldn't have been possible. Engine coupling joints, power relay nodes, life support distribution hubs. The humans hit components that our own engineers would need detailed schematics to locate. The general's mandibles clicked in rapid succession, a nervous habit that had developed since his encounter with the humans. But it wasn't just the targeting, Ambassador. It was the weapons themselves. Our intelligence had suggested the human ships were equipped with primitive kinetic projectile systems. Chemical propulsion, basic guidance systems, nothing that should have been able to penetrate our defensive screens. Kethvar made another note. But they did penetrate. They didn't just penetrate, they ignored our defenses entirely. Those projectiles moved through our energy shields like they weren't there. No dispersion, no energy absorption, nothing. It was as if the laws of physics had simply decided to exempt human weapons from normal limitations. Vexthal pressed his hand against the viewport, leaving a damp print on the surface. I watched the tactical display as Captain Chen's ship fired a single projectile at the destroyer's stellar judgment. The round traveled at approximately 15% light speed, fast, but not unprecedented. Our defensive systems had a full 3.7 seconds to intercept. The general turned back to face Kethvar, his eyes reflecting a deep trauma. The projectile changed course mid-flight. Not once, but 17 times. Each course correction was perfectly calculated to avoid our point defense fire while maintaining optimal trajectory to target. Ambassador, that's not technologically advanced. That's impossible. Kethvar felt his own breathing becoming shallow. What kind of guidance system? There was no guidance system, Vexthal said flatly. Our post-battle analysis of recovered projectile fragments showed they were solid metal. No electronics, no computational matrix, no quantum entanglement communicators. Just shaped metal moving through space in ways that violated every known principle of ballistic physics. The general began pacing again, his movements more agitated than before. The projectile struck the stellar judgment's primary power coupling with such precision that it caused a cascading shutdown of non-essential systems while leaving life support and emergency communications intact. The ship was completely helpless, but the crew remained alive and unharmed. Kethvar looked up from his notes. They deliberately avoided casualties? That was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire engagement. 47 warships, 15,000 crew members, and, in the space of 6 minutes, the humans had rendered 31 ships completely combat ineffective without killing a single being. Vexthal stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair with all 4 hands. Captain Chen opened communications again. "We've disabled your weapons and engines," she said, her voice still maddeningly calm. "Your life support systems are intact, and you have sufficient power for emergency operations. We recommend you use this time to reconsider your position." The general's voice took on a bitter edge. I was still thinking like a conventional military commander. I assumed they had expended their ammunition in that devastating opening salvo. I ordered the remaining 16 ships to concentrate fire on the lead human vessel while implementing emergency repairs on the disabled ships. Kethvar felt a growing sense of dread. That wasn't the end of the engagement. Ambassador, that wasn't even the beginning. What I had witnessed was the humans being polite. When we resumed hostilities, Vexthal's voice trailed off, and he began shaking again. "General, you must continue. The Council needs to understand what we're dealing with. Vexthal closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. The second human ship moved. I had been so focused on Captain Chen's vessel that I had almost forgotten about her companions. The ship was commanded by someone called Commander Jake Thompson. His response to our renewed attack was different. The general opened his eyes, staring directly at Kethvar. Where Captain Chun had been precise and surgical, Thompson was artistic. He began by firing a single projectile at my flagship. Not at any critical system, not at weapons or engines. He put a hole through the observation deck of my personal quarters. Kethvar felt a chill run through his nervous system. A warning shot. No, Ambassador. A signature. Thompson followed that shot with 14 more, each one placed with mathematical precision through non-critical sections of the Eternal Victory's hull. When he finished, the holes formed a perfect geometric pattern visible from external cameras. The general moved to his chair and sat heavily. Then, Thompson's voice came over the communication system. "Admiral Vexthal," he said, "and note that he promoted me, showing he understood our military hierarchy despite this being first contact. I've just drawn a happy face on your flagship using high-velocity projectiles while you were actively trying to kill me. Would you like me to add some artistic flair to your other ships?" Kethvar's hand had stopped moving across his data pad entirely. But the truly horrifying part came next. While Thompson had been creating his artwork on my flagship, he had simultaneously been engaging the other 15 active ships in my battle group. Not sequentially, simultaneously. His ship was firing projectiles in 16 different directions at the same time, each round following its own impossible trajectory to strike precisely where Thompson intended. Vexthal's mandibles clicked rapidly as the memory intensified. I watched the tactical display as Thompson's projectiles performed maneuvers that should have been physically impossible. Rounds would fire in one direction, then curve through space in graceful arcs to strike targets on the opposite side of the battlefield. Some projectiles would split into multiple fragments mid-flight, each fragment seeking a different target with the same impossible accuracy. The general stood abruptly and began pacing again, his movements becoming more frantic. Within 90 seconds, every remaining active ship in my battle group had been disabled. Not destroyed, Ambassador, disabled. Thompson had somehow calculated trajectories that would neutralize our weapons and engines while avoiding any critical life support systems. Kethvar found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "How is such precision possible?" That's what I asked Captain Chun when she opened communications for the third time. Her response: Vexthal stopped pacing and turned to face the ambassador directly. She laughed again. Not malicious laughter, Ambassador. She sounded genuinely amused. "General," she said, "you're asking the wrong question. You want to know how it's possible. You should be asking why we're bothering to be so precise." The general's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Then, she told me something that changed my understanding of warfare forever. Every projectile we've fired has been calculated to cause maximum tactical effect, with 0 casualties. We're doing this because we choose to, not because we have to. Commander Thompson could have killed everyone in your battle group with his first shot. Instead, he drew a picture. Kethvar felt his own hands beginning to tremble. But the demonstration wasn't over. The third human ship, commanded by someone called Colonel Maria Santos, had remained motionless throughout the entire engagement. Captain Chin's voice came over the communications one final time. Vexthal returned to the viewport, staring out at the nebula, as if seeking comfort in its distant beauty. "General Vexthal," Chin said, "we've shown you precision, and we've shown you artistry. Colonel Santos would like to demonstrate something else entirely. With your permission, she's going to show you what human weapons look like when we're not concerned about collateral damage." The general's reflection in the viewport showed a being haunted by memories that defied rational explanation. I should have ordered immediate retreat. Any sane military commander would have withdrawn from an engagement where the enemy had demonstrated such overwhelming superiority. But professional pride, Ambassador, professional pride, and the certainty that I was witnessing some form of elaborate technological illusion made me refuse to surrender. Kethvar realized he was holding his breath. Colonel Santos fired a single projectile into empty space. Not at any of my ships, not at the human research station, just into the void between our formations. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Vexthal's voice broke entirely. Ambassador, that single projectile somehow triggered a cascade reaction that turned a cubic light-minute of empty space into a controlled fusion reaction that lasted for exactly 13 seconds before dissipating harmlessly. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of Vexthal's labored breathing. A cubic light-minute, Ambassador. Colonel Santos had somehow weaponized the quantum vacuum itself, turned nothingness into a brief star, and then made it disappear as if it had never existed. Kethvar stared at the general, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. That's when I finally understood, Vexthal whispered. We weren't fighting a military engagement. We were attending a demonstration. The humans were showing us what they could do, and what they chose not to do. The general turned from the viewport one final time. Captain Chen's final communication was the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. General, she said, we hope this has been educational. Your ships and crews are unharmed. Please consider this a formal introduction to human capabilities. We look forward to future diplomatic discussions. Vexthal collapsed into his chair, visibly exhausted by the retelling. The 3 human ships then simply disappeared. Not faster than light travel, Ambassador. They just ceased to be visible. Our sensors couldn't detect them, our tactical systems couldn't lock onto them, but I knew they were still there. Watching, waiting. Ambassador Kethvar struggled to maintain his diplomatic composure as he processed General Vexthal's account. The implications of what he was hearing threatened to undermine everything the galactic community believed about warfare, physics, and the nature of technological advancement itself. General, Kethvar said carefully, what you're describing suggests capabilities beyond anything in our scientific understanding. The Council's xenobiologists insist that no species could develop such technology without leaving detectable traces of their advancement. Vexthal's laugh was hollow and bitter. Ambassador, you're still thinking in terms of technology. That was my mistake as well. I spent the next several cycles trying to understand what I had witnessed through the lens of advanced engineering and unknown scientific principles. The general stood and moved to the chamber's data terminal, his movements still unsteady. With your permission, I'd like to show you the sensor recordings from the engagement. Perhaps seeing the data will help you understand why I've struggled to convince anyone of what really happened. Kethvar nodded, though he felt a growing reluctance to delve deeper into this disturbing account. Vexthal activated the holographic display system, and the chamber filled with a 3-dimensional representation of the battle space. 47 ships arranged in standard formation, facing 3 small vessels that seemed laughably inadequate by comparison. This is real-time tactical data, Vexthal explained, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of a battle briefing. Full-spectrum sensors, gravitational anomaly detectors, quantum field analyzers, everything functioning at optimal efficiency. The hologram began to move, showing the opening moments of the engagement. Kethvar watched as the human ships charged directly into the concentrated firepower of the alien fleet. Watch the evasion patterns, Vexthal said, highlighting the trajectory of Captain Chen's vessel. Note the acceleration curves, the timing of directional changes, the gravitational forces that should have been generated. Kethvar studied the data carefully. What he saw made his blood run cold. The human ship wasn't just avoiding enemy fire. It was moving in ways that violated fundamental laws of physics. The acceleration readings, the ambassador whispered. These can't be accurate. I've checked and rechecked the sensor calibrations dozens of times. The readings are precise. Vexthal manipulated the display to show detailed telemetry data. Captain Chen's ship achieved acceleration rates that should have created gravitational fields measurable from nearby star systems. The G-forces alone should have crushed any biological life form to atomic paste. The hologram continued, showing the impossible projectile trajectories that had disabled the alien vessels with surgical precision. But here's what truly defies explanation, Vexthal said, advancing the display to show Commander Thompson's engagement. Watch the projectile from Thompson's ship that created the artistic pattern on my flagship. Kethvar leaned forward as the display tracked a single projectile's path. The metal round fired in one direction, then curved through space in a perfect arc, accelerated to strike the flagship, then somehow ricocheted to create the next hole in the pattern. A single projectile, Vexthal said quietly. Thompson fired one round that somehow struck my ship 14 times in sequence, creating that geometric pattern. The projectile's mass never decreased, its velocity never diminished, and it moved through space as if guided by an intelligence that could rewrite physics at will. The ambassador felt his understanding of reality beginning to crack. This is impossible. And yet it happened. But the truly disturbing revelation came during my investigation of the aftermath. Vexthal changed the display to show detailed scans of the damaged ships. Our engineers found something in the projectile impact sites that still haunts my sleep cycles. The display zoomed in on microscopic analysis of the projectile fragments. Kethvar stared at the data, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The metal composition was completely ordinary, Vexthal explained. Iron-nickel alloy, standard industrial grade. No exotic materials, no quantum-entangled components, no technological enhancements of any kind. Just shaped metal that had somehow moved through space in defiance of every known law of physics. Kethvar reached out to manipulate the holographic display himself, examining the data from multiple angles. There must be some explanation. Perhaps the humans have developed a form of localized gravitational manipulation. That's what I thought initially. But then, I discovered something that changed my perspective entirely. Vexthal advanced the display to show Colonel Santos' demonstration. Watch what happens when Santos fires into empty space. The hologram showed the projectile leaving the human ship and traveling into the void. For several seconds, nothing appeared to happen. Then, space itself seemed to ignite. A controlled fusion reaction triggered in the quantum vacuum, Vexthal said, his voice barely steady. Our physicists have analyzed this data for months. The energy release was equivalent to a small star, but it appeared and disappeared without leaving any residual radiation or space-time distortion. Kethvar stared at the display in horror. How is that possible? It isn't possible, Ambassador. That's the point. What Colonel Santos did violates the conservation of energy, contradicts our understanding of vacuum quantum fields, and should have been detectable by every civilization within 50 light-years. The general deactivated the display, leaving the chamber in relative darkness. But the most disturbing discovery came when I attempted to trace the humans' technological development. I sent intelligence operatives to Earth, expecting to find evidence of advanced manufacturing facilities, exotic research installations, or signs of contact with more technologically sophisticated species. Vexthal returned to his chair, his movements heavy with exhaustion. What my operatives found was a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel. Their most advanced weapons were chemical rockets and primitive fusion reactors. They had no manufacturing capability that could produce the materials I had witnessed in combat. They showed no signs of reverse engineering alien technology or receiving outside assistance. Kethvar felt a deep chill settling in his core. Then, how do you explain what happened? I can't explain it, Ambassador. That's what's driven me to this state. I've witnessed capabilities that shouldn't exist, performed by beings who shouldn't possess them, using methods that violate the fundamental laws of reality. The general leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's dim lighting. But I began to notice patterns in the human behavior that suggested a different explanation entirely. It wasn't their technology that defied comprehension, it was the humans themselves. Vexthal stood and began pacing again, his movements agitated. During the engagement, I monitored human biological signatures. Heart rate, brain activity, stress hormone levels, everything our sensors could detect. Do you know what I found? Kethvar shook his head, though he dreaded the answer. Nothing. No elevated stress responses, no adrenaline spikes, no signs of fear or excitement. Captain Chin's crew maintained baseline biological readings throughout an engagement that should have terrified any rational being into catatonia. The general stopped pacing and faced the ambassador directly. They weren't using advanced technology to perform impossible feats, Ambassador. They were simply doing things that their biology shouldn't have allowed. Captain Chin wasn't relying on sophisticated targeting systems. She was somehow calculating trajectories and timing with her organic brain that exceeded our most advanced computational systems. Kethvar felt his worldview crumbling. Are you suggesting the humans possess some form of psychic abilities? Not psychic, something far more fundamental. I began to research human evolutionary history, looking for clues about their development. What I found was a species that had survived every conceivable form of extinction event through adaptation and stubborn refusal to die. Vexthal's voice took on an almost reverent tone. Ice ages that should have frozen them to death, volcanic eruptions that should have poisoned their atmosphere, asteroid impacts that should have ended their civilization. Humans survived them all, not through luck or technology, but through an apparent ability to simply refuse to accept limitations. The general moved to the viewport again, staring out at the cosmic vista. Ambassador, I've studied warfare for 2 centuries. I understand tactics, strategy, logistics, and the psychological factors that determine victory and defeat. What I witnessed during the Terran Contact War wasn't military superiority. It was a species that had somehow evolved beyond the constraints that limit every other known form of life. Kethvar found himself struggling to breathe normally. General, what you're suggesting implies that humans represent a fundamental deviation from known biological principles. Exactly, and that's why I shake when I think about them. Vexthal turned from the viewport, his expression haunted. Because if humans can ignore the laws of physics through pure biological determination, if they can perform impossible feats simply because they refuse to accept that those feats are impossible, then what else might they be capable of? The general returned to his chair, collapsing into it, as if the weight of his memories had become unbearable. But my ordeal wasn't over, Ambassador. The engagement I've described was only the beginning. The humans had demonstrated their capabilities, but they hadn't yet shown me the true scope of what they could accomplish when they decided to take action. Kethvar felt his hands trembling as he made notes. There was more. Captain Chun requested a formal meeting to discuss future diplomatic relations. She invited me to visit their research station personally, promising safe passage and honest conversation about humanity's intentions in the galaxy. Vexthal's mandibles clicked rapidly as he recalled the memory. I should have refused. Any rational commander would have withdrawn immediately and reported the encounter to higher authority. But curiosity, Ambassador, curiosity, and the desperate need to understand what I had witnessed made me accept her invitation. The general closed his eyes, his entire body beginning to shake again. What I saw during that visit changed my understanding not just of humans, but of life itself. Ambassador Kethvar watched as General Vexthal struggled with the memories of his visit to the Human Research Station. The decorated military commander who had once inspired confidence in troops across dozens of campaigns now appeared fragile, almost broken by whatever he had witnessed. General, perhaps we should take a recess, Kethvar suggested gently. You seem distressed. Distressed? Vexthal's laugh was sharp and bitter. Ambassador, I've seen things that have convinced me that everything we understand about life in the galaxy is fundamentally wrong. Distress doesn't begin to describe my condition. The general stood and activated the chamber's holographic display again, but this time he called up images of the Human Research Station. The station itself appeared unremarkable. Vexthal began, his voice taking on the clinical tone he used when the memories became too intense. Standard modular construction, basic life support systems, minimal defensive capabilities. According to all observable evidence, it was exactly what it claimed to be, a scientific research facility studying stellar phenomena. The hologram showed a modest collection of interconnected modules orbiting a gas giant. To Kethvar's eyes, it looked primitive compared to the grand installations constructed by more established galactic civilizations. Captain Chen met me personally at the docking port, Vexthal continued. She was smaller than I had expected. Most humans are diminutive by our standards, but Chen seemed almost fragile. She couldn't have massed more than 60 kilograms, and she showed none of the obvious physical modifications that most warrior species develop. The general manipulated the display to show interior views of the station. She gave me a tour of their facilities, explaining their research into gravitational anomalies and quantum field fluctuations. The equipment was functional but unremarkable. Nothing I saw suggested the technological sophistication that would be required to perform the feats I had witnessed during our engagement. Kethvar studied the images carefully. The human technology appeared crude by galactic standards, assembled from basic components that most civilizations would consider obsolete. But then, Captain Chun took me to what she called their workshop, Vexthal said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Ambassador, what I saw in that room challenges every assumption about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The display changed to show a large chamber filled with what appeared to be simple hand tools and raw materials. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with metal ingots, electronic components, and half-finished devices. Chen introduced me to the station's chief engineer, a human called Marcus Webb. She explained that Webb was responsible for maintaining their equipment and developing solutions to technical problems as they arose. Vexthal paused the display and highlighted a figure working at one of the benches. Webb was constructing a replacement component for their primary sensor array, a complex quantum resonance amplifier that should have required specialized manufacturing facilities and exotic materials. He was building it by hand, using basic tools and standard metals. The ambassador leaned forward to examine the image more closely. That's not possible. Quantum resonance amplifiers require precision engineering at the molecular level. That's what I told Captain Chun. She smiled and asked Webb to demonstrate his construction technique. Vexthal's hands began trembling as he recalled the memory. Ambassador, I watched a human being reshape metal with his bare hands. Kethvar felt his throat constrict. Reshape metal? Webb took a solid iron rod and simply molded it like clay. No tools, no heat source, no technological assistance. He gripped the metal, and it flowed like liquid, taking whatever form he desired. Within minutes, he had crafted a component that should have required months of precision manufacturing. The general manipulated the display to show detailed scans of the finished component. Our sensors confirmed that the device was functionally perfect. Every dimension precisely calculated, every surface finished to molecular smoothness. Webb had somehow convinced matter to arrange itself according to his will. Vexthal deactivated the display and began pacing again, his movements agitated. I demanded an explanation. Chen looked genuinely puzzled by my reaction. It's just engineering, she said. Marcus has always been good with his hands. When I pressed for details about the technique, she seemed confused by the question. The general stopped pacing and faced Kethvar directly. Ambassador, I don't think the humans realize that what they do is impossible. They've somehow evolved capabilities that violate fundamental physical laws, but they consider these abilities completely normal. Kethvar made notes with hands that were no longer entirely steady. What else did you observe during your visit? Captain Chun introduced me to other members of her crew. Each one demonstrated abilities that should have been impossible. Vexthal's voice took on the rhythm of a scientific report, as if clinical language could somehow make the memories less disturbing. Dr. Lisa Park, their xenobiologist, was studying samples of local microorganisms. She could somehow perceive cellular structures without using any form of magnification equipment. She would look at a bacterial culture and describe its genetic composition in precise detail. The general returned to his chair, gripping the armrests tightly. When I asked her to explain her methodology, she said she was just looking really carefully. Our medical scanners confirmed that her observations were completely accurate. She was somehow seeing molecular structures with unaugmented human vision. Kethvar felt a deep chill settling in his nervous system. Did you observe other examples of these abilities? Lieutenant David Kim, their communications officer, was maintaining contact with ships across the star system without using any detectable transmission methods. He would simply concentrate, and somehow his thoughts would reach other human vessels instantaneously. Vexthal's mandibles clicked in rapid succession. When I asked about their communication technology, Kim looked confused. We just talk to each other, he said. It's not really technology. Our sensors detected no energy emissions, no quantum entanglement indicators, no signs of any communication method we understand. The general leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lighting. But the most disturbing demonstration came when Captain Chun offered to show me their manufacturing capabilities. She led me to what appeared to be an empty storage bay and asked what kind of equipment I would need to repair my damaged ships. Kethvar found himself holding his breath. I described a plasma coupling array that had been damaged during our engagement. Complex technology requiring specialized alloys and precision assembly. Chen nodded and asked her crew to put something together. Vexthal stood abruptly and began pacing again. Ambassador, I watched 6 humans create a fully functional plasma coupling array using nothing but raw materials and their bare hands. No manufacturing equipment, no assembly tools, no technical blueprints. They simply worked together, shaping metal and electronic components through direct physical manipulation. The general's voice was becoming increasingly strained. Within 2 hours, they had produced a device that exceeded the performance specifications of the original equipment. Our engineering teams would have needed weeks to design such a component and months to manufacture it using our most advanced facilities. Kethvar set down his data pad, his hands shaking too severely to continue taking notes. When I asked Captain Chun how such feats were possible, she gave me an answer that still haunts my dreams. We need it to work, she said, so it works. That's how things have always been for humans. The general stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair. I began to understand that I wasn't dealing with a technologically advanced species. I was encountering beings who had somehow evolved beyond the limitations that constrained every other form of life in the galaxy. Vexthal's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But Captain Chen wasn't finished with her demonstrations. She asked if I would like to understand why humans had developed such capabilities. When I indicated my interest, she offered to show me something she called human history. The general activated the holographic display again, calling up images that made Kethvar recoil in horror. She showed me recordings of human civilization, Ambassador. Thousands of years of documentation showing how the species had survived every conceivable form of extinction event. The display showed scenes of devastation that should have ended any rational civilization. Massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, ice ages, wars that consumed entire continents. But the humans didn't just survive these catastrophes, Vexthal continued. They thrived. Each extinction event made them stronger, more adaptable, more determined to overcome whatever limitations they encountered. The images shifted to show humans accomplishing impossible feats throughout their history. Individuals lifting weights that should have crushed them, surviving in environments that should have killed them, solving problems that should have been beyond their cognitive capabilities. Captain Chun explained that humans had learned to exceed their limitations whenever survival required it. Over thousands of generations, this ability had become encoded in their genetic structure. Vexthal manipulated the display to show medical scans of human physiology. Their bodies can somehow reorganize themselves at the cellular level to meet whatever challenges they face. Their minds can process information at rates that should be impossible for organic neural networks. Their consciousness can apparently interface directly with physical matter to accomplish whatever they determine to be necessary. The general deactivated the display and turned to face Kethvar directly. Ambassador, the humans aren't using technology to perform impossible feats. They are the technology. Their entire species has evolved into something that transcends the normal limitations of biological life. Kethvar stared at the general, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was hearing. But the truly terrifying realization came when Captain Chun asked me about galactic civilization. She wanted to understand how other species had developed, what challenges they had faced, and how they had solved the problems of interstellar expansion. Vexthal's entire body was shaking now. When I described the careful balance of power that maintains galactic stability, the complex treaties and trade agreements that prevent warfare between species, Chen looked puzzled. Why don't you just make things work the way you want them to? She asked. The general collapsed into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. I tried to explain the limitations that constrain galactic civilization. Resource scarcity, technological barriers, the physical laws that govern interstellar travel and communication. Chen listened politely, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't understand why these things should be limitations at all. Vexthal's voice became barely audible. That's when I realized the true scope of what humanity represented. They weren't just another species joining galactic civilization. They were beings who could potentially reshape reality itself according to their desires. Ambassador Kethvar sat in stunned silence as General Vexthal's account reached its crescendo. The implications of what he was hearing threatened to shatter everything the galactic community understood about the nature of reality itself. The chamber's ambient lighting seemed dimmer somehow, as if the universe itself was recoiling from the truths being revealed. "General," Kethvar said finally, his voice barely steady, "what you're describing suggests that humans represent a fundamental threat to the established order of galactic civilization." Vexthal looked up from his trembling hands, his compound eyes reflecting a deep trauma that went beyond mere military defeat. "Threat, Ambassador? That word assumes humans think in terms of conquest or domination. My final conversations with Captain Chun convinced me that humanity operates on principles that make such concepts irrelevant." The general stood and moved to the holographic display controls, his movements slow and deliberate. Before I departed the research station, Chun asked if I had any final questions about human intentions in the galaxy. I confessed that by that point, my military training had reasserted itself. I demanded to know what humanity planned to do with their incredible capabilities. Vexthal activated the display, showing a recording of Captain Chen's face. Even in holographic form, her calm expression and steady gaze seemed to fill the chamber with an unsettling presence. Chen's response was the most terrifying thing I've ever heard, not because it was threatening, but because it was so completely reasonable. The general's voice took on the cadence of exact quotation. "We plan to help," she said. "We've learned that existence is difficult for everyone. Humans have developed ways to make difficult things possible. We'd like to share that ability with others." Kethvar felt his blood turn to ice. "Share their abilities?" I asked the same question. Chun explained that humans had already begun developing techniques to teach other species how to exceed their limitations. She spoke about it as casually as discussing a new agricultural method or manufacturing process. Vexthal manipulated the display to show complex diagrams that hurt Kethvar's eyes to look at directly. She showed me preliminary research into what she called consciousness expansion protocols, methods for helping other species develop the same reality manipulation capabilities that humans possessed naturally. The general's voice was becoming increasingly strained. "Ambassador, Chun wasn't talking about giving us technology. She was discussing fundamental alterations to the nature of consciousness itself, the ability to think matter into new configurations, to perceive reality at quantum levels, to exceed physical limitations through pure determination." Kethvar struggled to breathe normally. The implications of such capabilities would end galactic civilization as we know it, Vexthal finished. If every species could manipulate reality through conscious will, if physical laws became merely suggestions that could be overridden by sufficiently determined thinking, then every assumption about resource scarcity, territorial boundaries, and technological advancement becomes meaningless. The general deactivated the display and returned to his chair, collapsing into it, as if the weight of memory was too much to bear. But Chen's final demonstration was what truly broke my understanding of reality. She asked if I would like to experience human capabilities firsthand, as a gesture of goodwill and mutual understanding. Vexthal's entire body began shaking violently. I should have refused. Every instinct screamed that I was venturing into territory beyond my comprehension. But curiosity, and the desperate need to understand what I was dealing with made me agree. The general closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Chun placed her hand on my forehead, "Ambassador." Just a simple physical contact. But the moment her skin touched mine, my perception of reality fundamentally changed. Kethvar leaned forward despite his growing horror. I could suddenly see the quantum structure of matter, the flowing patterns of energy that comprise what we call solid objects. The walls of the station weren't barriers. They were suggestions that I could choose to accept or ignore. The metal hull beneath our feet felt as malleable as liquid. Vexthal opened his eyes, and Kethvar was startled by the haunted emptiness he saw there. But more than that, Ambassador, I could sense the consciousness of every being on the station. Human and alien thoughts alike became visible to me, flowing like colored streams through a vast ocean of awareness. I understood that consciousness isn't produced by biological processes. It's a fundamental force of nature that biological processes can learn to access. The general's mandibles clicked in rapid, nervous succession. For approximately 17 minutes, I experienced reality from a human perspective. I could perceive the underlying patterns that govern physical laws, sense the quantum fluctuations that determine the behavior of matter and energy. I understood that what we call impossible is simply a failure of imagination and will. Kethvar felt his worldview crumbling entirely. During those 17 minutes, I could do things that violated every physical law I had ever learned. I reshaped metal with my thoughts, perceived events occurring light years away, communicated directly with other minds without any technological medium. Vexthal stood abruptly and began pacing with frantic energy. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the capabilities themselves, it was how natural they felt. While experiencing human consciousness, these abilities seemed obvious and inevitable. The limitations I had accepted my entire life felt like arbitrary restrictions I had imposed on myself. The general stopped pacing and gripped the edge of the table with all four hands. When the effect ended and I returned to normal awareness, the loss was devastating. Imagine spending your entire life in a dark cave, then seeing sunlight for the first time, then being forced back into eternal darkness. That barely approximates the psychological trauma of losing access to human consciousness. Kethvar realized his own hands were shaking uncontrollably. Captain Shin apologized for the temporary nature of the experience. She explained that permanent consciousness expansion required careful preparation and gradual adjustment. But she assured me that humanity was committed to eventually sharing their capabilities with all galactic species. Vexthal returned to his chair, his movements heavy with exhaustion and despair. She spoke about it as an inevitable evolutionary step. Just as biological life had emerged from chemical processes, consciousness-based reality manipulation was the next stage of development for intelligent species. The general's voice dropped to barely audible levels. Before I departed, Chun made one final offer. She said that if I ever wanted to experience permanent consciousness expansion, I should return to the station. Humanity would be honored to help me transcend my biological limitations. Vexthal looked directly at Kethvar, his compound eyes reflecting a depth of trauma that went beyond anything the ambassador had ever witnessed. Ambassador, I've been tempted to accept that offer every day since returning to civilized space. The memory of those 17 minutes haunts every moment of my existence. I've seen what's possible when consciousness operates without limitations, and returning to normal awareness feels like a living death. Kethvar felt his own sanity beginning to fracture. General, what are you recommending to the council? I don't know, Vexthal admitted, his voice breaking entirely. Humanity represents either the greatest opportunity or the greatest threat in galactic history. They could elevate every species to transcendent levels of existence, or they could inadvertently destroy the foundations of reality itself. The general stood and moved to the viewport one final time, staring out at the cosmic vista that had once seemed eternal and unchanging. What terrifies me most is that humans don't seem to understand the magnitude of what they're offering. To them, consciousness expansion is simply a natural development, like learning to use tools or developing agriculture. They can't comprehend why other species might find their capabilities disturbing. Vexthal pressed his face against the viewport, his breath fogging the surface. Captain Shin contacted me again last week. She wanted to inform me that human research teams had developed new consciousness expansion techniques that could be safely applied to any known species. She invited me to visit their primary research facility on Earth to observe the protocols firsthand. The general turned from the viewport, his expression a mixture of desperate longing and absolute terror. Ambassador, humanity is preparing to transform galactic civilization whether we consent or not. They genuinely believe they're offering a gift that no rational being would refuse. The concept that other species might prefer to remain within normal physical limitations simply doesn't occur to them. Kethvar stared at the general, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was hearing. I've spent months trying to decide whether to accept Chen's invitation. Vexthal continued. The opportunity to experience permanent consciousness expansion, to transcend the limitations that have defined my entire existence. It's almost irresistible. The general's voice became heavy with resignation. But I also understand that accepting such a fundamental transformation would mean the end of everything I've ever been. The being who returns from Earth wouldn't truly be Vexthal anymore. It would be something new, something that might not even remember or care about the concerns that brought me to this interview. Vexthal returned to his chair one final time, his movements slow and deliberate. So I remain here, Ambassador, caught between two impossible choices. I can accept humanity's offer and transcend every limitation I've ever known, or I can retain my identity and spend the rest of my existence haunted by the memory of what I've lost. The general looked directly at Kethvar with eyes that reflected the weight of cosmic uncertainty. And, soon, every being in the galaxy will face the same choice. Humanity is coming, Ambassador, and they're bringing gifts that we may not be able to refuse. The chamber fell silent except for the steady hum of life support systems. Outside the viewport, stars continued their ancient dance, unaware that the nature of consciousness itself was about to be transformed forever. In that moment, both beings understood that they had reached the end of one era and stood at the threshold of something entirely new. Whether that something would be transcendence or destruction remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same again.